Our minds are inescapably connected to our bodies, and trauma hides in our bodies in the form of what people call disease, is really dis-ease of the body.
Welcome to Heart with Anna. I am Anna Jaworski. My son Alexander was born with a single ventricle heart and has undergone 3 open heart surgeries. He is the reason I am the host of your program. Today's show is Liz Zangara, Living a Life of Healing, and our guest is Liz Zangara. We'll start today's program by learning a bit about Liz and her medical conditions in segment 1. In the second segment, we'll talk about how she specializes in acupuncture and the mind-body connection. In the final segment, we'll learn about Liz's career choices and how her congenital heart defect affected them. Liz Zangara is the mother of 2 sons, Dante and Luca. Liz is a heart warrior who was born with cc-TGA, or congenitally corrected TGA, transposition of the great arteries. She has had 7 surgeries over the last 30 years. Her last complication was a bacterial infection her doctors worried was possibly attached to her pacemaker. She has experienced tremendous amounts of emotional and spiritual growth over the course of her life. She works as an acupuncturist, yoga teacher, life coach, and she specializes in trauma and somatic work. It's become imperative to Liz to reach out to the CHD community to bring forth healing. Welcome to Heart with Anna, Liz.
Hi, Anna. Thanks for having me.
Oh, I'm so happy to be meeting you today, and I would love to learn more about your heart defect. Can you tell me when you were diagnosed and what caused your parents to be concerned?
I was 6 years old and I was sick, just like a regular run-of-the-mill fever sick. And my mom took me to my pediatrician, and my pediatrician heard a murmur. And she said to my mom, "It's probably nothing. It's probably because she's sick, but let her get better and bring her back." So we did that, and I was over my sickness and came back, and I still had the murmur. So they referred me out to a pediatric cardiologist. It took a long time for them to figure out what was going on. And this was back in 1976. My parents didn't even have health insurance.
Oh, no. Wow, 1976. And they didn't have the kind of equipment back then that they have now.
No.
So I'm sure they took an x-ray of your heart?
They did. They did lots of tests, lots of stress tests and x-rays. And what they ultimately ended up doing was a cardiac catheterization that year in 1976. And that's how they discovered the cc-TGA. Originally, they thought that I had a hole in my heart, but they didn't.
But you didn't. You had congenitally corrected transposition. Now, not all my listeners will know what that is. Can you explain what that means? Because I know some people think when they hear congenitally corrected, that means that there's nothing wrong, but that's not exactly the case.
If only it were. What it means is that in utero, my body somehow figured out how to make blood flow work. So my ventricles are reversed. My right ventricle sits on the left side of my body, and the left ventricle sits on the right side of my body. But somehow my heart worked out to have blood flow to my lung and also to my body. The problem with that is your left ventricle is designed to pump systemically to the rest of your body. So it's a much stronger muscle. And your right ventricle is designed to pump to your lung. So it's a very short distance to pump. So it's not as muscular.
Right.
The other issue is that in the twisting of the ventricles, my SA-AV node electrical system of my heart got twisted and didn't really work so well. So the connection between my atrium and ventricle in terms of sending signals was limited at that point.
So what that means is that you could have arrhythmias.
And I do, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I think somebody tried to explain cc-TGA to a child, and they explained it that when you started walking as a toddler, you just walked backwards, and you walked backwards your whole life. You could do it, but eventually the musculature of your legs would become different and become problematic because your muscles are just not made to work that way.
Right, right. I have learned so much over the last 27 years having a son with a congenital heart defect. And my son was also born with transposition of the great arteries, but not cc-TGA. He was born with DTGA. And my son was also born with a hypoplastic left ventricle. As you said, the left ventricle is the ventricle that is responsible for pumping blood to the entire body. And my son's is teeny tiny. So he was lucky to have TGA because his bigger ventricle was his right ventricle. And even though that's not designed to pump blood to the body, that was the bigger ventricle. And that's why he was able to stay alive until he was diagnosed. My son also had some holes in his heart, which meant that the TGA was not fatal for him. For some children, if it's not diagnosed early enough, you can actually die, because what happens is the body will pump the oxygenated blood to the lungs and the unoxygenated blood to the body, and that doesn't work. That's not going to work for very long. So did you also have some holes in your heart? Did you have an ASD or a VSD?
No, I didn't.
No, I mean, not a PDA or a PFO?
No.
Wow. That's amazing. So you had a heart catheterization when you were 6 years old. They discovered you have this really complicated condition. I'm sure they didn't find out about the twisting of the AV node at that time, right? Or did they? Were they able to tell that in a cath?
They were able to tell that early on. And what my doctor told me was that when I got older, probably when I was like 60 or 65, I would probably need a pacemaker.
Oh, really? He thought it would be that long before you would need a pacemaker.
Oh, he was very wrong.
Yeah, most of the people I know who have cc-TGA need pacemakers way sooner than that. So, and I know from your bio that you have had a pacemaker. So let's talk about that. When did you get your pacemaker?
I got my first pacemaker in when I was 21. So while all my friends were getting ready to go to bars because they could finally legally drink, I was getting a pacemaker.
Wow. Okay. So you went quite a while without needing a pacemaker. Did you have episodes where you fainted or felt lightheaded?
Yeah, that was the point where they decided that it was time to implant a pacemaker. I was 21 and I was living in Berkeley, California. I had gone there to do a Spanish immersion program for the summer, and I passed out.
Oh no.
I called my doctor and I was like, this is weird, but I passed out. So that was the summer that I was to fly back to New York, where my parents lived, where I lived, and get the pacemaker. And it was emotional. There was a lot of denial. I did a lot of canceling flights. I think I was supposed to come back 4 or 5 times. Kept calling my mom saying, I'm not on the plane, sorry. I can't really now in hindsight imagine what that was like for her.
I'm sure she was terrified.
Absolutely. I mean, both my parents, but my mom in particular was absolutely amazing in the way that she handled my heart. You know, she always made me feel like I was really special.
Aw, that's so sweet to hear. So did you have any surgeries before you had your pacemaker?
No, that was my first.
Wow. Okay. So no wonder you were so afraid. Were you seeing a cardiologist on a regular basis?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, for sure. I would go at least every year. And every year I'd go in and I'd ask, in my age group, who ran the longest on the treadmill? And then I would break that record. Like, I was always very competitive. It was always clear to me, like, I wasn't going to let this thing take me out.
Tonight Forever by the Baby Blue Sound Collective.
I think what I love so much about this CD is that some of the songs were inspired by the patients.
Many listeners will understand many of the different songs and what they've been inspired by. Our new album will be available on iTunes, Amazon.com, Spotify.
I love the fact that the proceeds from this CD are actually going to help those with congenital heart defects.
Enjoy the music.
Home Tonight Forever.
This content is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. The opinions expressed in the podcast are not those of Hearts Unite the Globe, but of the hosts and guests, and are intended to spark discussion about issues pertaining to congenital heart disease or bereavement.
You are listening to Heart with Anna. If you have a question or comment that you would like addressed on our show, please send an email to Anna Jaworski at anna@hearttoheartwithanna.com. That's anna@hearttoheartwithanna.com. Now, back to Heart with Anna.
Liz, let's start this segment by talking about your interest in the mind-body connection. That's something that has always fascinated me too. Can you tell me what work you do that highlights a mind-body connection?
I think all of the work that I do highlights the mind-body connection. When I graduated undergraduate, I was a social worker and I worked in domestic violence shelters and rape crisis centers. And so I did lots of counseling as a caseworker. And from that point, I felt like the talking wasn't enough, that I wanted to work with bodies as well. And then I started school for Chinese medicine. And while I did the school for Chinese medicine, I also got a certification in massage. So I did massage through school to pay my way through Chinese medical school. So I'm an acupuncturist, a massage therapist. I was also a doula. So I would actually go to home births as an acupuncturist.
Wow.
And do acupuncture on women in labor whose labors had stalled.
Wow.
And be there for the birth. And then recently, like in the last 5 years or so, I became a yoga teacher because I've been practicing yoga for 20 years. And then most recently, I've added health coach to my list of ways to connect with people because really I've been doing it in sessions with people throughout the last 20 years.
Wow, such a wide variety of interests. Did you go to college to earn a degree?
Yeah, so I have a bachelor's degree in women's studies and I have a master's degree in traditional Chinese medicine.
Oh, okay. Wow. Because you said you were
And I'm in
doing
New York State.
counseling. So I thought maybe you were a counselor as well.
No, I worked as a caseworker, and in that position, I did individual counseling with clients as well as run groups with clients who were victims of domestic violence and rape.
That's such a scary area to work with people, Liz. What drew you to that?
I think it all comes from my heart, right? Because there is this thing that happens when we see people and we don't know where they're coming from or what their past is or what they're going through. We just experience them in the moment. And people are so much more than that. And we really need to help people move through certain situations, right? I needed help moving through the situation with my heart. I've needed help moving through other situations in my life. Women can get really stuck because of the patriarchy. As I began to learn about this as a women's studies major, it became absolutely imperative to fight this, to make sure that people feel safe. That's like a human basic need.
That's so fascinating because talking about a mind-body connection, you're right. If psychologically you are unwell, a lot of times that can translate into ulcers, migraines, all kinds of physical problems.
Absolutely. Our minds are inescapably connected to our bodies, and trauma hides in our bodies in the form of what people call disease is really dis-ease of the body. It's a lacking of ease. And we have muscle memory. We have memory that's triggered by smells, sounds, visuals. And, you know, when we do more than just talk about it, we can embody the change, right? We can understand the change in an intellectual way. Like I was in that trauma, now I'm safe and I'm out of it. But until you really embody it and feel into it in your body, it hasn't completely cleared, I think.
Oh, I agree with you 100%. I was in a car accident and my car was totaled.
Oh my
I
God,
came out of it. Oh, it was awful. I came out of it with accident-induced scoliosis and whiplash, which is not uncommon considering the kind of accident I had. And I went to see a physical therapist, and she told me that I was suffering trauma as well. And that, like you, it's exactly what you're saying, that I wasn't feeling safe because before she even touched me, I was tensing up. And I didn't even realize I was doing it, Liz. She had to bring
Right.
my attention to the fact that I was doing that. And she said that it was very common after you had experienced a trauma. And so she did some mind body connection work with me, having me close my eyes, visualize myself in a safe place, and worked on me. And my doctor really felt that, given my age, when I had the accident, that I would be lucky to get back 85% usage of my arms and my back. But through working with Erica, my physical therapist, I'd say I'm 95 to 99% back. I mean,
That's fantastic.
I really, really worked hard, but she had me doing visualization and mental exercises, as well as electrically stimulating my back and helping my muscles to relax, because I had 3 ribs that were out of place.
Oh, so painful.
It was so painful. And
Yes.
one of the ribs popped back into place when I was in the office with Erica, and it sounded like a shot.
Yeah.
It was so loud. And the funny thing was that the same thing had happened earlier that morning when I got out of bed and was doing the exercises that Erica told me to do. I heard that crack and I could feel the rib go back into place, and it just felt so much better. And so I guess my body was definitely loosening up. And so then when I went and saw her, another one went back into place, and until finally all of my ribs were back into place and I didn't have the scoliosis anymore. But it really took a lot of time. And you're so right. There is a huge connection between being afraid of being hurt and how your body responds to that. So, as an acupuncturist, do you sometimes have to talk to people to find out if they're going through something stressful like that before they'll actually really be able to benefit from the work you do on them?
Oh, definitely. It's part of the intake process. It's not just your knee hurts or your back hurts or whatever your chief complaint is. The intake process also includes emotionally. How are you doing? What's happening in your life? What happened in the past? Are you carrying something that's difficult for you right now? Do you have support in your life? Do you have a support system? Do you have somebody you talk to? Are you in therapy? All of
Mhm.
these things.
Interesting.
So right off the bat, it's something that's included.
Yeah. So it sounds like you're a therapist
It
in
feels like
so
I'm a
many ways.
therapist.
Well, like you said, you have to know psychologically.
I had a patient once, and she was actually a yoga student of mine, and she had been going through cancer treatments. And she scheduled an appointment with me, and she said, I'm going through this, and you have no idea what it is. I used to be able to run, and now I'm battling lung cancer. You have no idea how difficult it is. And I said, I do. I really do. And she looked at me and she said, no, I'm looking at you. You just taught me a yoga class. You have no idea. And I shared with her that I have a backwards heart, and I pulled my shirt aside and I showed her my big scar and the big bump where my pacemaker is. And I said, I really get it. I couldn't run the way you ran before you had cancer.
Mm.
And it was such a softening moment for the both of us. And she became like a really special patient of mine.
Yeah. Well, you shared with her. So what you were doing was establishing trust.
But it's that recognition that we look at people and we assume all this about them. We know nothing, but we're all battling something. Nobody gets away with nothing, really.
That's so true. That is so true. And a lot of times they're invisible, like what you were saying, where unless you pulled your shirt aside, she wasn't going to see that scar. Her lung cancer was invisible to you. People who have ADHD or who suffer from a mental disorder, those are all invisible. And yet, like you said, most people make assumptions.
The fact that we all have something to deal with is an opportunity, right? It's an opportunity for self-growth and spiritual growth and finding a way through it.
Right. And I think what you talked about doing with your patient, how you established a connection, that's how we work through it in a healthy way. By making those connections, by being empathetic. It's one thing to be sympathetic, but most people don't want your sympathy. It's another thing to be empathetic. And that's what you were with that patient. You were able to completely empathize in a way that probably most people cannot.
Thank you. When you say, people don't want your sympathy, I can imagine the kind of sympathy that you received as the mom of a son going through what he went through. And so probably better than most people what the difference between sympathy and empathy is.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that's why my relationship with my friends who also have children with heart defects is so undeniably strong. Strong doesn't even begin to define it. It's like cement because we've all been in that office listening to a doctor tell us something no parent should have to hear. We've all been in that waiting room wondering if we're going to get a phone call that we don't want to hear, or if when our baby wakes up or our child wakes up, if they're still going to be the same person that we brought into the hospital. It's a horrible thing to have to experience. And when you meet somebody and they say, I have a child with a heart defect, you can hold hands with that person. You don't even have to say anything, Liz. Those shared experiences, they say it all.
I can't imagine. I mean, I'm on the other side of it where I have the heart condition and I have children. And so when I get sick, I get worried. Am I going to be here for them? And that's really the worst part of it,
Right. Because you love your children and you don't want them to experience your loss.
That's the worst part of it, for sure. I can handle anything. I can't handle leaving my kids that way,
Anna Jaworski has written several books to empower the congenital heart defect, or CHD, community. These books can be found at Amazon.com or at her website, www.babyheartspress.com. Her bestseller is The Heart of a Mother, an anthology of stories written by women for women in the CHD community. Anna's other books, My Brother Needs an Operation, The Heart of a Father, and Hypoplastic Left Heart Syndrome, a handbook for parents, will help you understand that you are not alone. Visit babyheartspress.com to find out more.
Heart to Heart with Anna is a presentation of Hearts Unite the Globe and is part of the Hug Podcast Network. Hearts Unite the Globe is a non-profit organization devoted to providing resources to the congenital heart defect community to uplift, empower, and enrich the lives of our community members. If you would like access to free resources pertaining to the CHD community, please visit our website at www.congenitalheartdefects.com for information about CHD, the hospitals that treat children with CHD, summer camps for CHD survivors, and much, much more.
You literally brought me to tears while we were talking in the last segment. But right now, I want to get into talking about your career choices, because obviously you have so much experience in helping to heal people. It sounds to me like maybe it came from a need for you to heal yourself. So can you tell me a little bit about that? What kind of career choices you've made and why?
I think that the desire to work with women was really born of really learning about the patriarchy. And I grew up in a very traditional Italian family. It was very loving and wonderful, but it was also very male oriented. And I definitely wanted to fight that. And so I began to advocate for women, but it just kept expanding. And finding body work, finding acupuncture and meditation and breath work, we call it pranayama in yoga, all that stuff. It's like, if you can't get in through the front door, then you try all the windows. They're all just ways to try and get in, because nobody's the same. And we're all the same, right? But everybody is affected differently by different ways of healing. So it's good to have a bunch of different techniques to try and reach somebody.
What brought you into the Chinese medicine?
I started doing researching of all the different kinds of work that I could do with people. And honestly, I should have been a doctor.
Yeah.
I know. I mean, it's one of my biggest regrets is that I should have been a cardiologist. Again, I was brought up in a very traditional Italian home. It was assumed that I'd have children and stay home with them. And so why would I become a doctor? We didn't think that way. And that was unfortunate, because I think I would have been a doctor. But anyway, to answer your question, I just started researching physical therapy and occupational therapy and Chinese medicine. And so I just started with one class. It was an intro to Oriental medicine class. And I sat through it and I listened, and on the way home, I was crying, and I just thought, I love this medicine. And it's a really beautiful medicine.
Mm-hmm.
And then I jumped in, and 5 years later, I had my master's degree and started practicing.
Okay, so I don't know a whole lot about Chinese medicine. The interesting thing is, most of what I have seen about Chinese medicine, I saw when I was taking yoga classes. There's some literature. So I think it goes hand in hand. Can you talk to me about the connection between the Chinese medicine and the yoga and acupuncture?
I think the thing that joins Chinese medicine and yoga and meditation and all those modalities are the willingness to sort of slow down and pay attention to what's happening. I think, Western medicine, we just look at one thing. Like, I go to my cardiologist, he just looks at my heart. He doesn't ask if I'm upset. He doesn't ask if my back hurts or if I've had any other issues with any of my organs. And Chinese medicine really looks at the whole body at once, as does yoga. So I think that that's sort of where, we know that we can calm our emotions with our breath, but you would never be asked to do that in a Western medical office.
No, you wouldn't.
Maybe you would. I mean, maybe there are some doctors that do that, but it would be rare.
Yeah, I think you're right. My husband is a nurse, and he actually took a week-long course on hypnotism, and he became a hypnotherapist. He's a nurse anesthetist. And sometimes people will come in and they will be very nervous and very upset. And so he'll talk to them. And if they tell him they're nervous or upset or whatever, he can talk to them. He doesn't use the word self-hypnosis, but that's what hypnosis is all about, is finding that calm spot. And you're right. Most places don't do that. I was really impressed that his hospital was forward thinking enough that they paid for him to take that week-long course. And he has been able to use it with some of his patients, but I wouldn't say that it's widely used, which is a real pity, because I think there are a lot of things that we could do to help people, especially when they're in a position where they may be anxious. They're getting a shot or an IV. Those are painful.
Every surgery that I've been rolled into as a mom, I'm always crying because I'm worried about my kids.
Sure.
And usually the response is, we're just going to give you some meds. Everything's going to be okay. You're going to be fine. And then knock me out with some meds.
If instead of just saying, we're going to knock you out, they said, we're going to do everything we can to make you come through this smoothly. Your kids are in the waiting room. Don't worry. Would that make a difference for you?
I think that they do say that. I mean, it would take time for me to breathe through it. Or like your husband does, right? It would take time for them to do that kind of work with me so that I could calm down on my own before they put me under. They just don't have that kind of time. And it's not the practitioner's fault. It's the medical system and the way that it's set up. They're pretty much focused on fixing a problem and sending people off. Whereas in Chinese medicine and the modalities that I practice, we're really open with the patient that this is not a one and done. This is your past now. You've discovered that there's this trauma in your life. You're going to work on it from now on. It's going to go away. It's going to get better. It's going to get worse. It's going to be like a wave. And when it shows up, I'm here to help you through it. And when it resides a little bit and moves back into like a back burner position and you don't need me, then go on your own. But when you need me, I'm here. And so there's a lot of patients that come and go throughout the years.
That's fascinating. I'm also the executive producer of a bereavement podcast. And one of the things that I've learned in working with Bereaved But Still Me is that once you suffer a trauma, subsequent traumas can trigger that original trauma, which is exactly what you were talking about, the wave. I haven't ever heard people really talk about it as a wave before, but that's exactly what it is, ebb and flow. And you can learn to work through that trauma. But when you experience another trauma, and it may be similar or it may not be, it may be something totally different, but all of a sudden you're smelling the same smells or you're having flashbacks to that other trauma, and that's totally normal. But it seems to me that would be a good time to revisit you so you can help them. So you're all about healing. When you do your job as an acupuncturist, is that also a way for you to help them heal with that mind-body connection?
Yeah, of course. There's different modalities to use with acupuncture. There's needles, but there's body work. There's, like you said, you had electrical stimulation on your back.
Mhm.
We do that as well. We do cupping and gua sha, breath work. There's lots of modalities to use. So we have a pretty big toolbox to help a patient.
Do you also do acupressure? I had a friend who was deaf. As a matter of fact, she worked at the school for the deaf when I did too. And she taught me a little bit about acupressure. She had a poster and it would show in some unusual ways how pinching your ear might help relieve stress somewhere that was not your ear. And I was fascinated by that. Do you also do that?
Doing acupuncture is actually puncturing an acupressure point. Maybe the most
Oh.
simple way that I can say it. So it's the same thing.
Okay.
One is more intense than the other, right?
Okay. I want to touch on one more question. We're going to
Yeah.
have you back. You're fascinating. And I have a feeling there are at
Oh,
least a
thank
couple more
you. I'd love to come
podcasts
back.
in you. But before we go, I was really intrigued when you said how you have grown spiritually through the trauma and the experiences you've had growing up with a heart defect. Can you talk briefly about that?
I don't know how it was for you as a mom, having a kid like me. My mom was really anxious and she covered it up pretty well when we were little. But I think as we got older, my sister and I saw that she was, a really anxious person. And my sister and I carry that anxiety as well, not necessarily related to trauma or my heart or anything. But I realized that what happens when you're anxious is that you can't really connect with yourself, right? So that you've got to find a way through that anxiety. I always say with my clients, the only way out is through, and it's always an inside job. So the anxiety came from me, and the anxiety comes from my medical. I have tons of medical trauma. I mean, I go in to get my blood work done, and I will say to the phlebotomist, I'm really bad with needles. I have a lot of medical trauma. You need to tell me what you're doing as you do it. I know at this point what I need to feel safe. But allaying the anxiety, slowing down the fear, accepting that what's going to happen is going to happen whether I'm fearful or anxious. And in this moment, I can better use my time by connecting with myself and connecting with my people rather than being anxious. And I used to live in fear, and I used to not tell people about my signs and symptoms. And I would feel bad or feel sick, and I wouldn't want to worry other people. But now I've learned that I'm opening up about it, and it actually moves it through my body and it moves it out of my mind. And I'm able to say, yeah, I was really sick this summer. I didn't know what was going to happen.
And is
then
that when they
there's,
were afraid that there was a bacterial infection on your pacemaker?
yeah. And so if there was, the fix was going to be that they had to take my pacemaker out and the leads, which I have 3 leads now in my subclavian with tons of scar tissue around them because they've been in there forever. It's a really dangerous surgery, and one that I just didn't want to embark on, having a 9-year-old at home.
Right.
I have to think about my kids. The bacteria that I had was a staph bacteria that normally grows on our skin and normally lives in our body.
Okay.
So there was nothing I could have done to make it happen, and there was nothing I could have done to prevent it.
Right.
But it happened, and I have come around to being grateful for the bacteria. I'm grateful that it happened. It was horrible. I had a PICC line for 6 weeks. I was in and out of the hospital 3 times over, a period of a month and a half. I needed daily injections. It was the hardest thing that I have gone through in my congenital defect life. And I'm probably going to have to be on antibiotics for the rest of my life. I have my blood checked every week or 2. I have cultures done. Tests keep going and going. It was really rough. But it also really made me understand that every day is precious. When I go to pick up my kid at school, I'm not overwhelmed. I'm like, wow, I'm really excited to see you. What are we going to do today? It's just changed everything. It's wiped out that layer of bullshit in life. There's this layer of what will people think? There's all this stuff. Authenticity has come to like the exterior level spiritually in a way for me that I'm really grateful for.
Wow. Well, it has certainly made you really hone in on what is most important in my life. And it's like you said, it's not the car you drive, it's not the house you live in. It's the people that you surround yourself with.
It's your
And-
relationships.
And having a purpose in life. Yes, relationships are so important. But also, I think feeling that you matter. And you have been an excellent guest. And I'm so glad I've gotten a chance to know you better, Liz. Thank you so much for coming on the program.
You've been an amazing host, Anna. Thank you so much for having me. It's the first podcast I've ever done.
Nobody would ever guess that. You were really, really fantastic. And you had so many beautiful messages to share with everyone. Thank you. Thank you, Liz. I really do appreciate it. That concludes this episode of Heart to Heart with Anna. Thanks for listening today. If you enjoyed this episode of Heart to Heart with Anna, please consider throwing a little love our way. We have a company called Patreon, where you can make a monthly donation to help us keep this podcast free to the world, or you can support us via PayPal. Just visit heartsunitetheglobe.org to sign up to be a patron, or use our PayPal account to give us a little love. We really appreciate it. And that's all for this week. Remember, my friends, you are not alone.
Thank you again for joining us this week. We hope you have become inspired and empowered to become an advocate for the congenital heart community. Heart to Heart with Anna with your host, Anna Jaworski, can be heard at any time wherever you get your podcasts. A new episode is released every Tuesday from noon Eastern Time.